Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis attended the University of Vienna, Austria, to study law. A friend, Jacob Koleschka, invited him to attend a lecture on medicine. Saving lives seemed more worthwhile than winning lawsuits, so Philip changed his studies to become a doctor. In 1844, Semmelweis graduated from medical school. He immediately accepted a position as assistant director of the Vienna Maternity Hospital. His boss was Director Johann Klein, a stern and overbearing man. Poor women came to the maternity hospital to have their babies. "They are charity cases," the director pointed out, "and cannot pay. We must save money wherever we can." The hospital had 2 wards, one to train doctors, the other to train midwives. Semmelweis was an obstetrician, a doctor who takes care of women during childbirth. An older practice already existed. Specially trained people, known as midwives, helped in births. Expectant mothers who entered the hospital were sent to one of the 2 wards, one run by the midwives, the other by the doctors. For some reason, women begged to be sent to the midwives' ward. "Whatever for?" Philip asked one anxious patient. "Surely you would prefer to be treated by a doctor than a midwife?" Sobbing, the woman shook her head. She wouldn't give her reason. Clearly, she was afraid to speak, thinking she might offend him. From others he heard the rumor that women feared the doctors' wards because more patients died there than in the midwife's ward. Although Director Klein objected, Philip Semmelweis began investigating the hospital conditions. Each ward held about 400 patients. In one ward, where only the midwives worked, about 4 or 5 mothers died each month. To Philip's dismay, in the second ward, where doctors attended the mothers, as many as 100 patients died each month, 1 mother out of every 4. Philip Semmelweis decided to talk it over with his friend Jacob Koleschka. "Is it really that bad?" Jacob asked. He taught at the maternity hospital, too. "The death rate in the doctor's ward is appalling," Philip said. "I've collected the facts. Director Klein wasn't too happy to give them out. I can understand why. In the last 6 years, about 2,000 women have died in the doctor's ward." "What about the midwife's ward?" Jacob asked. "They suffered only 700 deaths." Jacob couldn't believe it. "It must be wrong. Something in the figures don't add up." Semmelweis sadly shook his head. "No, my figures are entirely correct. The doctor's ward is nothing more than a murder chamber. So-called ignorant midwives save more lives than trained doctors. It is incredible." During his student days, Semmelweis had become interested in childbed fever. It was a type of infection and the greatest killer of mothers at the maternity hospital. At the time, he thought of it as a scientific puzzle. Now that he saw the disease firsthand, he could no longer think of the problem in such unemotional terms. Philip Semmelweis dreaded making his rounds at the doctor's ward. He dreaded the desperate moans of dying women and the frightened faces of their neighbors. Philip patted their hands and tried to reassure them. What could one person do to save the lives of all these helpless women? Dr. Semmelweis became determined to track down the cause of the childbed fever. A year passed. During that time he learned nothing to prevent the disease or even to reduce its deadly toll. Like so many doctors before him, he assumed childbed fever could not be spread by contact. After a year at the hospital, Philip took a vacation. When he returned, he heard some terrible news. "Jacob Koleschka is dead," he was told. "Your friend became sick with some sort of blood poisoning, and within a week he died." After the personal loss of the tragedy had softened, Philip began to question the cause of his friend's death. What kind of blood poisoning, he wondered. Philip read the report of Kolutska's death. Why, the symptoms are those of childbed fever. Yet Jacob is certainly not a mother. How could a man get the disease? Then someone remembered an injury Jacob Kolutska had received only a week before his death. Kolutska and a student were in the morgue, performing an autopsy on a woman who died of childbed fever. The student accidentally nicked Kolutska's finger. It bled a little, only a few drops. With clear logic, Semmelweis saw the answer. He concluded that childbed fever was contagious. His friend Jacob had acquired the disease from the corpse. Dr. Kolutska, the other professors, and their students had been spending hours examining dead bodies. They would then proceed to their wards to attend to living, healthy patients. Not only that, but the doctors didn't bother with cleanliness. A doctor might leave the morgue after dissecting a corpse, rush to the operating room for surgery, and then go straight to the wards. During this time he neither washed his hands nor changed his blood-stained coat. Young doctors actually prided themselves upon their blood-encrusted examination coats. It made them feel more experienced. Philip could not shake the horrible thought of his discovery. The doctors themselves were carrying the disease from the dead bodies in the morgue to living patients, and then from one patient to the next. The midwives never performed an autopsy. Also, Philip Semmelweis knew that the head midwife demanded that the midwives be clean and neat. She even had her students line up each morning and hold out their hands, proving their fingernails to be clean. He still didn't know what caused childbed fever, but now he was certain how to prevent it. Have the doctors wash their hands before examining patients. That very day, Philip announced the discovery to his medical students. The students looked at one another, confused and rather angry. They stared back at him coldly. "Wash our hands? We will be humiliated." Philip looked at them, confused. Humiliated? In what way? Why, the head midwife has the midwives line up and present their hands to her each morning. The doctor puffed up his chest. "We're doctors, not midwives. We don't have time for such foolishness." "It's undignified," another student said. "I am ashamed of all of you," Semmelweis told his students. "To think that you would rather a poor mother die than lose your dignity. You will wash your hands or leave this hospital." When Professor Klein saw the wash basins, he immediately called for Philip. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Philip explained. "My students are to wash their hands in soap and water and then rinse in chlorine water. It will prevent the occurrence of childbed fever." "That is the most outlandish idea I have ever heard. You must be joking." "No," Philip said. "I am perfectly serious." "Then you must have lost your senses," Professor Klein snapped. "This experiment has no medical value. We must watch our budget. There's no money in the budget for soap and chlorine water." But Philip Semmelweis found the money for the soap and chemicals. He also replaced the bed linens as soon as they became soiled. The students and Klein did not like the changes. Klein openly encouraged the students to disobey. He judged the success of a doctor by whether he became wealthy, not by how many lives he saved. Yet Semmelweis's plan worked. The death rate in his wards dropped spectacularly. In 1846, the doctor's ward had averaged a 10% death rate. 1 woman in 10 had died. With Philip Semmelweis's simple hand-washing plan, the number dropped to 1%, only 1 woman out of every 100. "Coincidence," Director Klein said coldly. "Nothing but pure coincidence. Epidemics come and epidemics go." "You're accusing us of murder," his students cried. They blamed epidemics of childbed fever on the weather, bad air, overcrowding, coincidence, everything but themselves. Then, in 1847, the death rate began to climb again. From 1% it rose to 5%. What was the cause? To Philip's horror, he found that young doctors were deliberately disobeying his orders. He hid out of sight. As he watched, a doctor went to see a patient without first washing his hands in the special chemical solution. Philip's cry of outrage stopped the student in his tracks. "You must wash your hands in the basin of chlorine. No exceptions." The young doctor's face turned scarlet. "I'll have nothing else to do with this childish hand-washing in foul-smelling chemical solutions." "You cold-blooded killer, get out and don't come back. You'll save more lives by leaving medicine than by becoming a doctor." With Dr. Klein's backing, the students became more bold. They ridiculed Philip Semmelweis, and they ignored his teachings. And the poor young mothers continued to die. Johann Klein looked for a way to punish Philip. Finally, Klein had his revenge. In 1849, Hungary and Austria went to war. Philip was a Hungarian. Johann Klein used the war as an excuse to demote Philip. He put Philip in charge of teaching the midwives. Instead of treating an actual patient, he would train the midwives using a mannequin, a life-sized doll. Director Klein kept up the pressure and eventually drove Dr. Philip Semmelweis from Vienna. Philip took up a position at a hospital in Budapest. As soon as he left, Director Klein tossed out the wash basins. The students rejoiced. Of course, with the end of hand-washing, the number of childbed fever cases climbed to record heights. Johann Klein and the medical students didn't mind. They were rid of that despised hand-washing, and that is all that mattered to them. Late in the 1860s, doctors finally began to accept the fact that many diseases are caused by tiny microscopic organisms, germs, which can be spread from one person to another by contact. The discovery of the germ theory of disease came too late for Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis. In 1865, he nicked his hand while operating and died of the same disease he had tried for so long to prevent.